Hi, I'm Elena. Last Thanksgiving, my mother looked my husband straight in the eye and said, "Maybe next year you can actually contribute something meaningful to this family." What she didn't know was that Marcus had just closed a deal that morning, worth more than my entire family's net worth combined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They thought they were looking at a failure. They had no idea they were staring at a $50 million empire. Before we dive into how spectacularly wrong they were, tell me in the comments, have you ever had your family completely misjudge someone you love? Because this isn't just a story about wealth. It's about what happens when years of quiet humiliation finally meet undeniable truth. The thing about Thanksgiving at the Castellano house in Millbrook Heights is that it's never really been about gratitude. It's been about performance, about who drives the newest car, who has the most impressive job title, who can name-drop the most exclusive restaurants they've dined at this year. My family treats the dinner table like a boardroom where everyone's fighting for the position of most successful. I should have seen it coming. The moment Marcus and I pulled into the circular driveway in our modest Toyota Camry, the same reliable car we'd been driving for 3 years, I caught my brother Vincent smirking through the front window. He was probably already calculating the depreciation value, ready to make some cutting remark about practical choices and living within your means. Marcus squeezed my hand as we sat in the car for a moment. "You ready for this, love?" he asked, his voice gentle but tired. We'd had this conversation before. Every family gathering, every holiday, every birthday party became an endurance test. Not because my family was openly hostile, but because they had perfected the art of subtle condescension. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one delivered with a smile. They don't mean to be cruel, I had told myself for years. But watching my husband's shoulders tense as we approached the mahogany front door, I wondered if I'd been lying to myself all along. The house itself was a monument to my father's success in commercial real estate. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and imported Italian leather furniture. Everything screamed expensive, and everyone who entered was meant to feel either impressed or inadequate. There was no middle ground in the Castellano world. My sister Bianca answered the door, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she air-kissed my cheeks. "Elena and Marcus," she added, her smile tightening just a fraction. "How nice to see you both." The pause before nice lasted exactly 1 second too long. Long enough for Marcus to notice, long enough for me to feel that familiar knot forming in my stomach. "Bianca," Marcus replied warmly, offering one of his genuine smiles. "Thank you for having us. I brought those dinner rolls you mentioned loving last time." He held up a paper bag from Giuseppe's Bakery, not the fanciest place in town, but their bread was incredible. Bianca took the bag like it might contaminate her manicure. "Oh, how thoughtful. I'll just put these with the other contributions." The way she said contributions made it sound like we'd brought day-old discount store cookies. As we entered the foyer, the familiar symphony of passive aggression began. Cousin Anthony was adjusting his Rolex while discussing his latest promotion at the law firm. Uncle Roberto was holding court about his new Porsche, complete with detailed specifications that no one had asked for. My mother, Francesca, glided between guests in her St. John knit suit, orchestrating conversations like a conductor leading an orchestra of superiority. "Elena, darling." She embraced me, then turned to Marcus with what I'd learned to recognize as her tolerant smile. "Marcus, how are things in the technology world?" She said technology the way most people might say sewer maintenance. My mother had never quite grasped what Marcus did for work. To her, if you weren't wearing a suit to an office building every day, you weren't really working. The fact that Marcus often worked from home in jeans and a t-shirt was proof, in her mind, that his career lacked seriousness. Things are good, Mrs. Castellano. Actually, really good, Marcus replied. There was something in his voice, a note I'd been hearing more often lately. Not defensiveness exactly, but a quiet confidence that seemed to grow stronger each time. My family dismissed him. I'm sure they are, she replied with a patronizing pat on his shoulder. It's so nice that you have your little projects to keep you busy. Projects. As if building software solutions was the equivalent of weekend woodworking. We made our way to the living room where the rest of the family had assembled. The conversation was the usual performance. Stock portfolios, vacation homes, private, school tuitions, country club memberships. Each story was really a humble brag wrapped in casual conversation. I watched Marcus settle into the corner of the leather sectional, content to listen rather than compete. He'd stopped trying to share details about his work years ago. The last time he'd mentioned developing a new platform for supply chain optimization, my father had literally yawned and changed the subject to his latest property acquisition. What none of them knew, what I barely understood myself, was that Marcus had been quietly building something extraordinary. For the past 4 years, while they were dismissing him as the family disappointment, he'd been developing technology that was revolutionizing how major corporations managed their logistics. The calls that came at odd hours, the late-night video, conferences with people in different time zones, the mysterious business trips to cities I'd never heard him mention before. It was all starting to make sense. But sitting in that living room, watching my family perform their annual ritual of financial one-upmanship, while my husband smiled politely from the sidelines, I had no idea that in less than 6 hours, everything they thought they knew about success would be turned completely upside down. The afternoon stretched ahead of us like a minefield. I could already see Vincent preparing to make his usual jokes about the simple life, and Bianca getting ready to offer unsolicited career advice. My mother would inevitably suggest that Marcus might want to consider more stable opportunities, and my father would find subtle ways to mention how important it is for a man to provide properly for his family. They had no idea what was coming. None of us did, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There's something almost ritualistic about the way my family dismantles people they consider beneath them. It's not loud or obvious. That would be crude. Instead, it's precise, surgical, delivered with practiced smiles and concerned voices that make you question if you're being too sensitive. As I sat watching Marcus politely navigate another minefield of backhanded compliments, I realized this wasn't new. This was a carefully choreographed performance my family had been perfecting for the 3 years since our wedding. It started the moment we announced our engagement. I remember sitting in this same living room, Marcus's hand warm in mine as we shared our news. The congratulations came quickly, but so did the questions. "How wonderful, darling," my mother had said, her smile bright and sharp. "And Marcus, remind me what you do again? Something with computers?" When he explained that he was developing software solutions for logistics companies, my father had leaned back in his leather chair and nodded slowly. "Ah, tech support. Well, that's practical. Actually, I'm developing the software, not supporting it," Marcus had corrected gently. Of course, Father had replied, though his tone suggested he saw no meaningful difference. That became the pattern. Every explanation Marcus offered would be subtly minimized, reframed, or simply ignored. When he mentioned working with Fortune 500 companies, they heard contract work. When he talked about international clients, they heard freelancing. When he described building proprietary systems, they heard troubleshooting computers. The wedding planning revealed their true feelings. During our engagement party at the Rosewood Country Club, I overheard my Aunt Sophia telling a group of family friends, "Elena's marrying a very Sweet man. He works with computers. It's not what we expected, but she seems happy. Sweet. That became their favorite word for Marcus. Sweet. As if he were a well-meaning child rather than a grown man. Sweet. As if kindness were compensation for lack of ambition. Sweet. As if being genuinely good-hearted was somehow quaint and old-fashioned. The gift-giving occasions were the worst. Last Christmas, my brother Vincent had presented Marcus with a Computers for Dummies book, joking that he thought it might help with his little tech hobby. Marcus had laughed good-naturedly and thanked him, but I saw the flash of something in his eyes. Not hurt exactly, but a kind of weary recognition. For my birthday in March, the family had gathered at Romano's, the expensive Italian restaurant my mother favored for special occasions. When the check came, my father had made a show of reaching for his wallet while glancing meaningfully at Marcus. "Don't worry about it, son," he'd said with magnanimous condescension. "This one's on me. I know how expensive these places can be when you're just starting out." Marcus was 32 years old. He'd been just starting out for longer than most. People's entire careers, according to my family's narrative. The career advice never stopped coming. Uncle Roberto, who sold insurance, regularly suggested that Marcus might want to consider something more stable in financial services. Cousin Anthony, fresh from law school, had earnestly recommended that Marcus look into paralegal work. You know, something that uses your attention to detail, but with better job security. Even my sister Bianca, whose greatest professional achievement was managing social media for her friend's boutique, felt qualified to offer guidance. "Have you ever thought about teaching?" she'd asked Marcus during Easter dinner. "I mean, if you like computers, maybe you could teach computer skills to kids. Very rewarding work, even if it doesn't pay much." The subtext was always the same. "You're not successful enough for our Elena, but we're too polite to say it directly." What frustrated me most wasn't just their treatment of Marcus, it was how they'd managed to make me complicit in it. Every time I didn't correct their assumptions, every time I let a backhanded comment slide, every time I chose family peace over defending my husband, I became part of the problem. I started making excuses for why we couldn't attend certain events. "Marcus is traveling for work," I'd say, which was true but incomplete. He traveled because major corporations flew him to their headquarters for consultations, not because he was desperate for any work he could find, but my family had already written his story. In their version, Marcus was a struggling freelancer who worked from home because he couldn't find real employment. They saw his casual dress as lack of professionalism, his flexible schedule as lack of ambition, his contentment as lack of drive. They never asked about the late-night calls from Singapore, the encrypted files he worked on, or why companies kept flying him first class to meetings they considered crucial. They never wondered why someone supposedly struggling financially never seemed stressed about money, never asked to borrow anything, never mentioned concerns about bills or expenses. The pattern was so established that Marcus had stopped trying to correct it. When Uncle Roberto asked how the computer thing was going, Marcus would simply say, "Fine," and change the subject. When my mother made comments about finding something more stable, he'd nod politely and thank her for her concern. I began to realize that my family didn't want to understand what Marcus actually did. Understanding would require acknowledging that their assumptions might be wrong, and their entire social hierarchy was built on being right about who mattered and who didn't. The most painful moment came during our anniversary dinner last year. We'd invited the family to celebrate at Meridian, an upscale restaurant downtown. As we toasted our second year of marriage, my father had pulled me aside. "Elena, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice gentle but serious. "Your mother and I have been talking. We love Marcus. We really do. He's a good man. But we're concerned about your future. Have you thought about what happens if this computer thing doesn't work out? Maybe it's time he considered something more traditional, The word hung in the air between us. Traditional. Like success only counted if it came in a form they recognized. That night, driving home in our modest Camry, I'd finally asked Marcus if my family's treatment bothered him. He'd been quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel. "Your family loves you," he'd finally said. "They want what's best for you. They just don't understand that what's best for you is someone who makes you happy, not someone who makes them comfortable." But I could see it wearing on him. The constant need to prove himself to people who had already decided he wasn't worth their respect. The way he'd grown quieter at family gatherings, more withdrawn, as if he'd finally accepted that he would never be enough in their eyes. What none of us knew, what I was only beginning to suspect, was that while my family was busy dismissing Marcus as a failure, he was quietly building something that would make their accomplishments look like participation trophies. The signs had been there all along. I just hadn't known how to read them. The morning Marcus got the call that would change everything, I was standing in our kitchen making coffee, completely unaware that our lives were about to shift into an entirely different orbit. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and my phone was buzzing with texts from my mother about Thanksgiving seating arrangements. She was worried about balancing the table properly, code for making sure the successful family members weren't clustered together while the disappointments got relegated to the kids' table extension. Marcus emerged from his home office, still in the Harvard t-shirt and sweatpants he'd thrown on for what I assumed was another routine video call. But something was different. His face held an expression I'd never seen before. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of quiet intensity. That made me pause mid-pour. "Everything okay?" I asked, offering him the first cup of coffee. He took it absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. That was Harrison Tech Industries. They want to buy the platform. I knew Marcus had been working with Harrison Tech for months. They were one of those massive conglomerates you see in business magazines, but never really think about. The kind of company that owns dozens of smaller companies that manufacture everything from medical devices to automotive parts. But Marcus talked about all his clients in the same measured tone, so I didn't immediately grasp the significance. "That's great, honey. What kind of timeline are they thinking?" Marcus sat down at our small kitchen table, the one we'd bought secondhand, when we first moved in together. "They want to close by end of week. Full acquisition, not licensing. They're offering—" He paused, running his hand through his hair. "Elena, they're offering $52 million. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers. I watched it fall in slow motion, watched the ceramic shatter against our linoleum floor, watched the coffee spread across the small kitchen like spilled ink. $52 million. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, the clarification, the explanation that would make this make sense. Marcus wasn't the kind of person who dealt in millions. Marcus was the guy who clipped grocery store coupons and researched tire prices for 3 weeks before making a purchase. Marcus was the man my family had spent 3 years treating like a well-meaning underachiever. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Marcus stood up, carefully stepping around the broken ceramic. "The logistics optimization platform I've been developing. Harrison Tech has been beta testing it across their entire supply chain for 8 months. They want to buy it outright, the software, the patents, everything." My legs felt unsteady. I sat down heavily in the chair across from him. $52 million for your computer program? He smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "It's a bit more complex than a computer program, love." But yes, the questions came tumbling out. How long had he known this was a possibility? Why hadn't he told me Harrison Tech was interested in buying? What exactly did this platform do that made it worth more money than I could conceptualize? Marcus patiently explained what I should have understood years ago. The little tech hobby my family had dismissed was actually a revolutionary system that could predict and prevent supply chain disruptions before they happened. The computer troubleshooting they'd joked about was software that could save multinational corporations millions of dollars annually in lost productivity and missed deliveries. Remember when I was working late for 3 months straight last year? Marcus asked. That was because Samsung wanted to test the platform across their entire global operation. The results were so significant that word spread through the industry. Samsung. Global operations. I felt like I was learning about my husband's life for the first time. The calls from Singapore, I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Those weren't tech support calls. No. That was the regional director for Yamamoto Industries. They wanted to discuss implementation across their Pacific Rim facilities. Yamamoto Industries. I'd heard that name before, probably in business news articles I'd skimmed over. They were massive, one of those companies that seemed to manufacture half the products in any given store. Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened a folder I'd seen him work on countless times but never really examined. Inside were contracts, correspondence, and technical specifications that might as well have been written in a foreign language. But the letterheads were unmistakable. Harrison Tech Industries, Samsung Electronics, Yamamoto Industries, Schneider Logistics, Continental. Supply chain solutions. Companies I recognized from Fortune 500 lists. Companies with revenues larger than the GDP of small countries. And they were all writing to my husband, the man my family had spent 3 years pitying. Marcus? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been working with companies like this? About 4 years. Since before we got married? 4 years. Our entire relationship, my family had been treating him like a charity case while he was quietly building business relationships with some of the most powerful corporations in the world. I thought about every family gathering, every condescending comment, every piece of career advice offered by people who had no idea what they were talking about. Uncle Roberto, who sold car insurance, had regularly suggested Marcus might want to look into tech support positions at local businesses. Cousin Anthony had earnestly recommended that Marcus consider pursuing an IT certification to make himself more marketable. Meanwhile, Marcus was developing technology that these massive corporations considered essential to their operations. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Why didn't you tell them? Marcus closed the laptop and looked at me with that patient expression I'd come to know so well. Would it have mattered? Your family had already decided who I was. Explaining wouldn't have changed their minds. It would have just made them think I was lying or exaggerating. He was right, and we both knew it. My family's dismissal of Marcus had never been based on evidence or understanding. It had been based on appearance, on their narrow definition of success, on their need to feel superior to someone. Besides, Marcus continued, I wasn't ready to go public with this. The technology wasn't fully developed, the patents weren't secured, and I didn't want to count on something that might not happen. But now it was happening. Harrison Tech's offer was real, substantial, and immediate. Marcus showed me the preliminary contract, pages of legal language that basically boiled down to, we want to give you more money than most people see in several lifetimes for something you built in our spare bedroom. I sat in our small kitchen, surrounded by the modest furnishings we'd carefully budgeted for, trying to process the fact that my husband, the man my family had spent years treating like a disappointment, was about to become wealthier than all of them combined. The irony was staggering. My father, who had built his success in real estate over 30 years, was worth maybe $8 million. My brother Vincent, who never missed an opportunity to mention his law firm salary, made about $400,000 annually. My sister Bianca, who had married well and never let anyone forget it, lived off her husband's pharmaceutical sales income of roughly $600,000 per year. Marcus was about to make more money in one transaction than all of them had earned in their entire careers, combined. And in 3 weeks, We'd be sitting around the Thanksgiving table where they would undoubtedly continue their tradition of offering him career advice and expressing concern about our financial future. The thought almost made me laugh. Almost. Because first, I had to figure out how to process the fact that the man I'd married was apparently a genius who had been hiding his brilliance from everyone, including me. The week following Marcus's revelation felt like living in an alternate reality. I'd wake up each morning expecting to discover it had all been an elaborate dream, but then I'd see him on another video call with Harrison Tech's legal team, or I'd catch glimpses of the contract documents spread across our dining table, and the surreal truth would hit me again. My husband wasn't just successful, he was about to be extraordinarily wealthy. And somehow he'd managed to achieve this while my entire family remained blissfully ignorant, continuing their 3-year campaign of gentle condescension. But as the days passed and I began to understand the true scope of what Marcus had built, I started noticing things that made my stomach turn. Things that revealed just how deliberately my family had been rewriting history to fit their preferred narrative. It started when I was helping Marcus organize his files for the acquisition. We were sitting in his office, what I'd always thought of as the spare bedroom where he did his computer work, sorting through years of correspondence. That's when I found the folder labeled Castellano Family Events. "What's this?" I asked, pulling out a thick stack of printed emails. Marcus glanced over, and something shifted in his expression. "Just documentation. I started keeping records about 2 years ago." Documentation. The word sent a chill down my spine. Why would someone need to document family interactions unless something was seriously wrong? I opened the folder and immediately recognized the first email. It was from my mother, sent 3 days before our second anniversary dinner, the one where my father had pulled me aside to express concerns about Marcus's career prospects. "Elena, darling," the email read, "I wanted to give you a heads up that your father and I plan to have a serious conversation with you about Marcus's employment situation this weekend. We've been patient, but it's been 2 years now, and we're worried about your future. Perhaps it's time to encourage him to pursue something more stable. Uncle Roberto knows someone in insurance who might be willing to give him a chance, despite his unconventional background. Love, Mother." I stared at the screen, reading it twice to make sure I understood correctly. They had planned that conversation. They had strategized about how to convince me that my husband was a failure who needed their help finding a real job. "She sent this to you?" I asked, my voice hollow. "She sent it to both of us," Marcus replied quietly. "She copied me on it, thinking she was being transparent. Both of us." My mother had openly discussed plans to undermine my husband's confidence, and she'd included him on the email. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I kept reading. The next email was from my brother Vincent, sent the day before our engagement party. "Hey, Marcus," it began with false familiarity. "Looking forward to celebrating with you guys tomorrow. Quick thought, maybe don't talk too much about the computer stuff during the party. Some of Dad's business associates will be there, and you know how these old school guys are about tech workers. Might be better to keep things vague. Just a suggestion. See you tomorrow. V. Computer stuff." As if Marcus's work was some embarrassing hobby that needed to be hidden from respectable company. The folder contained dozens of similar communications, text messages, emails, even a few printed Facebook comments that Marcus had screenshotted. A pattern of systematic dismissal disguised as family concern. There was my sister Bianca's text from last Christmas. "Elena, maybe you could suggest that Marcus dress a little more professionally for dinner tonight. I know he's comfortable with the casual look, but grandmother will be there, and you know how she is about first impressions. Don't want her to think he's not taking the family seriously." This was sent about my husband attending Christmas dinner with his wife's family, in his own casual clothes, as if he were a child who needed to be coached on appropriate behavior. I found screenshots of a group chat between my mother, sister, and Aunt Sophia, one that didn't include me. The messages were from 6 months ago, right after Marcus had Declined to attend my cousin's wedding because he had a business trip. Francesca. I feel so bad for Elena. She's always making excuses for why he can't come to family events. Bianca. It's probably because he's embarrassed. I mean, what would he talk about with Roberto's colleagues? They're all successful businessmen. Sophia. Maybe we should be more inclusive? Ask him about his interests? Francesca. We try. But what is there to say about tech support? It's not like he's building anything important. Bianca. At least he's employed. Remember when we thought he might be unemployed entirely? Sophia. Elena deserves better, but she seems happy. I suppose love isn't always practical. I stared at these messages, reading them over and over. My family had been having ongoing discussions about my marriage, analyzing my husband's perceived failures, expressing pity for my supposedly poor judgment. And they'd been doing it in a group chat that deliberately excluded me. The most damaging discovery came near the bottom of the folder. It was a series of emails between my mother and her sister-in-law, Margaret, who lived in California. Margaret had mentioned meeting someone at a business conference who worked in logistics technology and made an absolutely fortune developing software for major corporations. Francesca had replied, "How interesting. You know, Elena's husband claims to work in something similar, but I think it's more like tech support or computer repair. You know how these young people exaggerate their job titles these days. He works from home in his pajamas, so it can't be too serious." Margaret had responded with details about the software professional she'd met, how he'd been featured in Forbes, how his company had been acquired for tens of millions, how logistics technology was revolutionizing global commerce. My brow. Mother's reply was brief. Well, that certainly doesn't sound like Marcus's situation. He's a sweet boy, but Elena married for love, not money. Sometimes that's more important. This exchange had happened 8 months ago. 8 months ago, someone had tried to tell my mother that Marcus's field was incredibly lucrative and important, and she had dismissed it outright. She had actively chosen to maintain her ignorant assumptions rather than consider that she might be wrong. But the worst part wasn't my family's ignorance. It was their deliberate effort to isolate Marcus from opportunities to correct their misunderstandings. I found emails where they had strategically seated him away from business discussions at family dinners. Text messages where they had asked me to handle conversations about career topics so Marcus wouldn't feel out of his depth. They had created an echo chamber where their misconceptions could flourish unchallenged, and they had convinced themselves they were being kind by protecting Marcus from conversations that might highlight his supposed inadequacies. As I reached the end of the folder, I found one final document that made everything click into place. It was a printed conversation between my parents from their shared email account, discussing Thanksgiving plans for this year. Father. Should we invite Marcus to sit with the men after dinner? They'll be talking business and he might feel excluded. Mother. Better not. You know how sensitive he gets about career topics. Let's just keep things light and pleasant. Elena says he's doing well with his computer work, so let's just leave it at that. Father. Agreed. No point in making him uncomfortable by bringing up money or investments. Different worlds, you know? Mother. Exactly. We'll focus on family and gratitude. Much safer topics. They had literally planned to exclude my husband from business conversations at Thanksgiving because they assumed he had nothing valuable to contribute. They were going to treat him like a child who needed to be protected from adult topics. In 3 days, these same people would be sitting around a dinner table, offering career advice to a man who had just closed a $52 million deal. Closed the folder and looked at Marcus, who had been watching my face as I read. How long have you been dealing with this? I asked. Since the engagement, he replied. But it got worse after we married. That's when they stopped pretending to be interested in what I actually do. 3 years. For 3 years, my family had been systematically undermining my husband while convincing themselves they were being supportive. And Marcus had documented every single instance, not out of vindictiveness, but because he'd needed proof that he wasn't imagining their treatment. Sitting in our small home office, surrounded by evidence of my family's willful ignorance, I realized that the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner wasn't going to be just another awkward family gathering. It was going to be a reckoning. The Harrison Tech acquisition closed on a Friday afternoon. I watched from our kitchen doorway as Marcus signed the final documents via DocuSign, his laptop screen displaying numbers that still didn't feel real. When he closed the laptop and looked up at me, we were officially $52 million wealthier than we'd been at breakfast. "So," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "What now?" Marcus stood up and stretched, as if he'd just finished any ordinary workday. "Now we figure out what we want to do with our lives." But I wasn't thinking about our lives. I was thinking about Thanksgiving dinner, now just 5 days away. I was thinking about my family's carefully planned seating arrangements, their strategic conversation topics, their protective exclusion of Marcus from serious business discussions. I was thinking about 3 years of documented condescension sitting in a folder upstairs. "Marcus," I said slowly, "are you planning to tell my family about this?" He was quiet for a long moment, washing our coffee mugs in the sink. What would be the point? That answer bothered me more than I expected. "What do you mean, what would be the point? Your family has spent 3 years convinced that I'm a failure. Do you really think they'll celebrate discovering they were wrong, or will they just find new ways to diminish this?" I wanted to argue with him, to defend my family's capacity for growth and understanding. But I'd spent the week reading their emails, their texts, their private conversations about Marcus's perceived inadequacies. I'd seen how they'd actively resisted information that contradicted their assumptions. "They deserve to know," I said, though I wasn't sure why I believed that. "Do they?" Marcus turned to face me. "Elena, your mother spent 8 months being told that logistics technology was a lucrative field, and she chose to believe I was still doing tech support. Your brother gave me a Computers for Dummies book as a joke. Your sister suggested I become a teacher because at least that would be rewarding, even if it didn't pay well." He was right, but something in me resisted accepting it. "Maybe if they understood what you actually accomplished—" "They didn't want to understand," Marcus interrupted gently. "Understanding would have required admitting they were wrong. It was easier to keep me in the box they'd built." That night, I called my best friend from college, Sarah, who'd moved to Portland and worked as a corporate lawyer. I needed perspective from someone outside the situation. "Let me get this straight," Sarah said after I'd explained everything. "Your husband just sold his company for $52 million, and your family still thinks he's unemployed." "Not unemployed. They think he does tech support." "Elena, that's insane. How is that even possible?" I tried to explain my family's worldview, their assumptions about success and respectability, their systematic dismissal of anything they didn't understand. But hearing myself describe it to an outsider made it sound even more absurd. "You have to tell them," Sarah said firmly, "if for no other reason than to stop them from embarrassing themselves further." But Marcus's words kept echoing in my head. What would be the point? I spent the weekend researching Marcus's industry, trying to understand what I'd missed. I read articles about supply chain optimization, about the billions of dollars companies lost annually due to logistics failures, about the emerging field of predictive technology. I learned that Marcus's work wasn't just successful. It was pioneering. The more I understood, the more my family's ignorance felt deliberate. Marcus hadn't hidden his work from them. He'd tried to explain it, multiple times, in the early days of our relationship. But they'd glazed over, changed the subject, or offered unsolicited advice about pursuing more stable careers. By Sunday evening, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to tell my family about the acquisition before Thanksgiving, but I wasn't going to help them avoid embarrassment either. "I want to see what happens," I told Marcus as we prepared for bed. I want to see how far they'll take this. Marcus looked concerned. Elena, I don't need vindication from your family. This isn't about vindication. It's about truth. What kind of truth? I thought about that folder upstairs, about 3 years. Of documented dismissal, about my family's active resistance to understanding who my husband actually was. The truth about who they are, I said, and who I am for letting this happen. Monday morning, my mother called to confirm our Thanksgiving, attendance and discuss logistics. The conversation was typical. What should I bring? What time should we arrive? Would Marcus be comfortable with the seating arrangement she'd planned? I've put him next to Cousin Tommy, she said brightly. You know, your Uncle Roberto's youngest. He just graduated with a computer science degree, so they'll have something in common. Cousin Tommy, 22 years old, fresh out of college, still living with his parents. My mother thought he'd be an appropriate conversation partner for Marcus. That sounds perfect, I said, my voice steady. Wonderful. And Elena, maybe suggest that Marcus wear something a little more professional? I know he's comfortable with casual clothes, but your Aunt Margaret will be there, and she's always so well put together. Aunt Margaret. The same Margaret who'd tried to tell my mother about the successful logistics technology professional she'd met at a conference. The conversation my mother had dismissed because it didn't match her preconceptions about Marcus. I'll mention it, I lied. Tuesday, I received a group text from my sister Bianca. Can't wait for Thursday. Mom's been cooking for days. She's so excited to have the whole family together. Let's make sure to keep things light and fun. No heavy topics or work stress. No heavy topics. No work stress. They were already planning to steer conversations away from anything that might accidentally reveal their misconceptions. Wednesday evening, Marcus finished a call with his lawyer about setting up investment accounts for the acquisition money. As he hung up, he looked at me with something between amusement and resignation. You know this is going to be complicated, right? He said. Once they know, everything changes. Our relationship with them, their perception of our marriage, their understanding of the last 3 years. Maybe everything needs to change, I replied. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the folder upstairs, about my family's group chat discussions of my poor judgment, about their plans to protect Marcus from business conversations because he supposedly had nothing to contribute. I'm prepared for the truth, I said. Even if the truth is ugly, I met his eyes. Especially if the truth is ugly. Thursday morning dawned cold and gray. As I got dressed for Thanksgiving dinner, I found myself choosing my outfit more carefully than usual. Not because my family expected it, but because I wanted to look like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Marcus emerged from the bedroom wearing khakis and a button-down shirt. Perfectly respectable, but not the professional attire my mother had requested. He looked like himself, which was exactly what I wanted. Ready? He asked, picking up his car keys. I thought about the dinner ahead, about my family's planned conversations and careful seating arrangements, about their ignorance of the man they'd been dismissing for 3 years. Ready, I said. As we drove toward Millbrook Heights, I realized I wasn't nervous anymore. I was curious. After 3 years of watching my family diminish my husband, I was finally going to see what happened when reality collided with their carefully constructed assumptions. I was about to learn whether they were capable of growth, or whether they'd double down on their prejudices even when faced with undeniable evidence. Either way, by the end of the evening, we'd all know exactly who we were dealing with. The Castellano house looked exactly as I'd expected. Every window, glowing warmly, luxury cars lined up in the circular driveway like a small auto show. Marcus parked our Camry between Vincent's new BMW and Uncle Roberto's Lexus, and I watched him take in the display with that same patient expression he'd worn to every family gathering for 3 years. Last chance to prepare them, he said quietly, as we sat in the car for a moment. No, I replied. I want to see who they really are. We walked to the front door carrying our contributions, Marcus's homemade dinner rolls and my grandmother's green bean casserole recipe. Simple offerings that I knew would be received with polite condescension and forgotten within minutes. Bianca answered the door in a cream-colored cashmere dress that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. "Elena, Marcus!" She air-kissed. Us both, her smile bright and practiced. Perfect timing. We were just opening the wine. The house buzzed with the familiar energy of a Castellano gathering. Cousin Anthony was holding court near the fireplace, regaling Aunt Sophia with stories about his latest case. Uncle Roberto had cornered my father by the bar, probably discussing investment strategies. The women clustered around the kitchen island, sampling appetizers and exchanging compliments about each other's outfits. "Marcus!" My mother appeared with her hostess smile firmly in place. "How wonderful to see you! And don't you look nice?" The pause before nice was subtle but unmistakable. I watched Marcus register it with the same weary recognition I'd seen dozens of times before. "Thank you for having us, Mrs. Castellano," Marcus replied warmly. "The house looks beautiful." "Oh, you're so sweet to notice. Come, let me introduce you to Cousin Tommy. He just graduated from state with a computer science degree. I thought you two might enjoy comparing notes." I watched this exchange with new eyes, seeing the manipulation I'd missed before. My mother wasn't making an innocent introduction. She was managing Marcus, placing him with someone she considered his intellectual equal. A recent college graduate with no professional experience. Cousin Tommy turned out to be exactly what I'd expected, eager, nervous, and thrilled to meet someone who worked in tech. He immediately launched into a monologue about his studies, his internship at a local IT company, and his hopes of landing a position at a startup after the holidays. "So, what kind of programming do you do?" Tommy asked Marcus with genuine interest. "I develop logistics optimization software," Marcus replied simply. "Cool, like inventory management stuff?" I watched Marcus's face carefully as he answered. "Among other things, yes." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "That's awesome. I did a project on inventory systems in my database class. Super interesting how you can use algorithms to predict stock levels." "It is interesting," Marcus agreed, and I could hear the kindness in his voice. He wasn't going to embarrass this kid by explaining that his college project barely scratched the surface of what Marcus had built. "Tommy's hoping to get into app development," my mother interjected, beaming at her nephew. "Such an exciting field these days. So much opportunity for young people who understand technology." The implication was clear. Technology was a young person's game, and Marcus was lucky to have found his niche before age made him obsolete. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself cataloging each interaction with forensic precision. When Marcus mentioned he'd been traveling for work, Uncle Roberto asked if he was doing IT consulting for small businesses. When he talked about working with international clients, Cousin Anthony suggested he might want to look into expanding locally since foreign contracts can be unreliable. The most painful moment came when Aunt Margaret, the same Aunt Margaret who'd tried to educate my mother about the logistics technology industry, was introduced to Marcus. "Oh, you're Elena's husband," she said brightly. "Francesca tells me you work with computers. How interesting." I held my breath, wondering if she'd make the connection to the Forbes featured professional she'd met at her conference. But my mother quickly steered the conversation away. "Marcus is very technical," Mother said smoothly. "He's always so patient when we have computer problems. Just last week, he helped me reset my iPad password." Aunt Margaret smiled politely and nodded, the moment passing without recognition. My mother had successfully reduced Marcus to the family IT support person, and Aunt Margaret had no reason to question it. During cocktail hour, I excused myself to use the bathroom and overheard a conversation that made my stomach clench. Vincent and his wife Sarah were talking quietly in the hallway. "He seems nice enough," Sarah was saying, "but don't you feel bad for Elena sometimes? What do you mean? Well, she's so accomplished and he's, you know, sweet but not exactly ambitious. I mean, he's 32 and still works from home in his pajamas. Elena seems happy, Vincent replied, but his tone suggested he shared his wife's concerns. Of course she says she's happy. What else is she going to say? But you can see it in family photos. She's always so put together, and he looks like he just rolled out of bed. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to my brother's wife dissect my marriage based on absolutely nothing but appearance and assumption. When I returned to the living room, I found Marcus exactly where I'd left him, still patiently listening to Tommy explain his senior project. But now I noticed other conversations happening around him, subtle discussions of career achievements, investment strategies, and business opportunities that explicitly excluded him. My father was telling a group about his latest property acquisition, a commercial complex that would generate substantial passive income. Uncle Roberto was describing his insurance agency's expansion into 3 new markets. Cousin Anthony was sharing details about a high-profile case that might earn him a partnership track. Marcus sat quietly through all of this, occasionally asked about his own work, but every time he began to explain what he actually did, someone would interrupt with oversimplified questions or change the subject entirely. That's so interesting about logistics, my father said when Marcus mentioned working with supply chains. I imagine that's quite technical. Roberto, didn't you have some issues with deliveries at the agency last month? And just like that, Marcus's sophisticated work in predictive technology was reduced to delivery problems at an insurance office. As we moved toward the dining room for dinner, my mother pulled me aside. Elena, dear, I hope you don't mind, but I've seated Marcus between Tommy and cousin Lisa. Lisa just started working at that tech company downtown. Data Flow Solutions, I think? They'll have lots to talk about. Data Flow Solutions. I knew that. Company. They provided basic data entry services for small businesses. My mother had essentially seated my husband at the children's table of technology professionals. That sounds perfect, I said, my voice carefully neutral. As we took our seats around the extended dining table, I looked around at my family. These people I'd loved and respected my entire life. These successful, educated professionals who prided themselves on their intelligence and sophistication. And I realized that Marcus was right. They didn't want to understand who he was. Understanding would require admitting they'd been wrong, and that was apparently more uncomfortable than maintaining their ignorance. But as my father began carving the turkey and my mother started her traditional gratitude speech, I knew that their comfort zone was about to be permanently disrupted. Because sometime during this meal, someone was going to ask the wrong question or make the wrong assumption, and Marcus's patience was going to run out. And when it did, 3 years of willful ignorance were going to collide with $52 million worth of reality. The moment came during dessert, and it wasn't Marcus who broke first. It was me. We'd made it through dinner with the usual performance. My father had dominated conversation with stories about his latest real estate ventures. Uncle Roberto had offered unsolicited financial advice to anyone who'd listen, and Marcus had been politely nodded at whenever he spoke, then promptly ignored. The seating arrangement had worked exactly as my mother intended. Tommy spent the meal enthusiastically explaining basic programming concepts to Marcus, while cousin Lisa from Data Flow Solutions offered earnest advice about breaking into the tech industry and building a professional network. The key is LinkedIn, she'd told Marcus seriously over the main course. You really need to optimize your profile and start connecting with decision makers. I could introduce you to our IT manager if you're interested in something more stable. Then freelancing. Marcus had thanked her politely and asked about her work at Dataflow. When she described their data entry services with obvious pride, he'd listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that made her light up. He never once mentioned that her company's entire annual revenue was probably less than what he'd made in the past week. But it was during the pie service that everything unraveled. My mother was distributing slices of her famous pumpkin pie, making her rounds with practiced hostess efficiency when she paused behind Marcus's chair. "Marcus, dear," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal concern that had always made my skin crawl. "I've been thinking about our conversation last Easter, about finding something more established. You know, with benefits and retirement planning. I felt my fork freeze halfway to my mouth. She was doing this now? In front of the entire family? Roberto mentioned that his friend who owns the insurance agency downtown is looking for someone to handle their computer systems," she continued, oblivious to the tension radiating from my side of the table. "It might not be as exciting as your current projects, but it would offer real security. I could arrange an introduction if you're interested." The room had gone quiet. Not completely. There were still side conversations happening at the far end of the table, but our immediate section had tuned in to watch this familiar performance. My family loved these moments when someone offered Marcus career guidance. It made them feel helpful and superior simultaneously. I watched Marcus's face carefully. He was still wearing that patient expression, but something had shifted in his eyes. A decision being made. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Castellano," he said calmly. "But I think I'm good with my current situation." "Oh, sweetheart." My mother laughed, the sound light but patronizing. "I know you enjoy the flexibility of working from home, but at some point you need to think about the future, about providing properly for Elena. Providing properly for Elena." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Vincent, sensing an opportunity to join the intervention, leaned forward with his lawyer's voice. "Mom's right, Marcus. I know the tech thing seems fun now, but what happens in 10 years? 20 years? You can't freelance forever." "The market's getting saturated anyway," added Cousin Anthony. "Everyone thinks they can make it in tech these days. Better to find something stable while you still can." I felt something hot and furious building in my chest. 3 years of this. 3 years of watching my family systematically diminish my husband while congratulating themselves on their concern and wisdom. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of agreement around the table, "Marcus just finished a major business deal this week." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't care. I was done watching this performance. My mother smiled indulgently. "That's wonderful, dear. What kind of deal?" I looked at Marcus. He was watching me with something between surprise and resignation, as if he'd known this moment would come eventually. "Tell them," I said to him directly. "Tell them about Harrison Tech." Marcus set down his fork and looked around the table. Suddenly, he had everyone's attention in a way that felt different from their usual polite dismissal. "Harrison Tech Industries bought my company," he said simply. "We closed the acquisition last Friday." There was a moment of confused silence. My family was trying to process this information through their existing framework of Marcus as struggling freelancer. "Bought your company?" Uncle Roberto asked slowly. "I didn't know you had a company." "I've been developing logistics optimization software for the past 4 years, Marcus explained. Harrison Tech has been beta testing it across their global operations. They decided to acquire the platform outright." That's wonderful," my father said, though he sounded uncertain. "What kind of, was it a significant sale?" Marcus looked at me again. I nodded slightly. $52 million, he said quietly. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced at a Castellano family gathering. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of people processing good news. It was the shocked stillness of people whose entire worldview had just been shattered. Tommy dropped his fork. It clattered against his plate with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. 52, Cousin Lisa started, then stopped, her mouth hanging open. Million? Vincent finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded once, then reached for his water glass as if he'd just mentioned the weather. My mother was staring at him with an expression I'd never seen before, complete bewilderment mixed with something that might have been fear. "But that's," she started, then stopped. "That's more than all of our net worths combined," my father finished quietly. He was looking at Marcus like he was seeing him for the first time. Uncle Roberto, who had spent the evening dispensing financial wisdom to anyone who'd listen, was now speechless. Cousin Anthony, who'd been recommending that Marcus find something stable, looked like he might be sick. The far end of the table had gone quiet too, conversations dying as the news traveled down the line. Aunt Sophia was whispering urgently to her husband. Cousin Margaret, the same Margaret who'd tried to educate my mother about logistics technology, was staring at Marcus with dawning recognition. "You're the one," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "The logistics software developer I met at the conference in Denver. The one featured in Forbes." Marcus smiled slightly. "Probably. I told Francesca about you," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "I said I'd met someone in your exact field who'd made a fortune. She said—" She stopped, looking at my mother with something between confusion and accusation. My mother's face had gone pale. I didn't realize—" "You didn't want to realize," I said, my voice steady but cold. "Margaret tried to tell you that Marcus's field was lucrative, and you dismissed it because it didn't match what you'd already decided about him." The table erupted in overlapping conversations. Tommy was asking Marcus technical questions with new respect in his voice. Vincent was trying to backtrack his earlier comments about market saturation. Uncle Roberto was attempting to offer investment advice as if the previous 3 years of condescension had never happened. But I was watching my mother, who sat frozen in her chair, the elaborate Thanksgiving dinner she'd orchestrated forgotten, around her. She was finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. 3 years of treating a multimillionaire like a charity case who needed her help finding basic employment. "Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "You remember what you said to Marcus when we arrived today?" She looked at me with something approaching panic. "You said he looked nice," I continued. "You introduced him to Tommy because you thought they'd have something in common, both working with computers. You offered to set him up with a job, doing tech support at an insurance agency." The color drained from her face completely. "For 3 years," I said, standing up from my chair, "you've been offering career advice to someone who just made more money than Dad will see in his entire lifetime. And you never once asked what he actually did because you'd already decided he wasn't worth understanding." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the smallest side conversations had stopped. "Elena," my father said quietly, "we didn't know—" "You didn't want to know," I interrupted. "There's a difference." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, as if a dam had burst, everyone began talking at once. "Marcus? I had no idea." Uncle Roberto started. "52 million, that's incredible," Tommy was saying. "We should have asked more questions," Aunt Sophia murmured. But through it all, my mother sat frozen, staring at Marcus like he was a stranger who had somehow appeared at her dinner table. The elaborate hostess mask she'd worn for decades had completely slipped, revealing something raw and panicked underneath. "I need some air," I announced, pushing back from the table. I walked toward the French doors that led to the back patio, not caring if anyone followed. The November air was sharp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere inside. I stood on the stone terrace, looking out at my mother's perfectly manicured garden and tried to process what had just happened. Behind me, I heard the door open and close. Marcus appeared beside me, his hands in his pockets, looking remarkably calm for someone who had just detonated a bomb in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. "Feel better?" he asked quietly. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 3 years." "And finally exhaled," I said. Do you think I went too far? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Your mother just offered to help me get a job doing tech support for an insurance agency. After I told her I'd sold my company for $52 million. I looked back toward the dining room windows, where I could see animated conversations happening around the table. My family was probably trying to make sense of what they'd just learned, recalibrating their understanding of the past 3 years. They're going to want to pretend this never happened, I said. By Christmas, they'll have convinced themselves that they always knew you were successful. Probably, Marcus agreed. People have a remarkable ability to rewrite history when it becomes inconvenient. The door opened again, and my father stepped onto the patio. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his usual confident bearing replaced by something uncertain and apologetic. Marcus, he said, his voice careful, I owe you an apology. We all do. Marcus turned to face him. You don't owe me anything. Mr. Castellano. Yes, I do. My father moved closer, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture I recognized from childhood. It's what he did when he was preparing to deliver difficult news. I've spent 3 years treating you like you were some kind of charity case, like you weren't good enough for my daughter. You were protecting your family, Marcus replied diplomatically. I understand that. No, you don't understand, my father said, his voice gaining strength. I wasn't protecting anyone. I was being an arrogant ass who thought he knew better than everyone else. I stared at my father. In 43 years, I had never heard him admit to being wrong about anything, let alone use language like that. When Elena told us she was marrying you, he continued, I looked at your casual clothes, your work-from-home situation, your youth, and I decided you weren't serious. I decided you were some kind of dreamer who was going to hold my daughter back. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. I never asked what you actually did because I'd already made up my mind, my father continued. I saw what I expected to see and I convinced everyone else to see it too. Dad, I started, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. He looked directly at Marcus. 3 years ago, when you asked for Elena's hand in marriage, do you remember what you told me? Marcus nodded slowly. I told you that I loved your daughter and that I'd spend my life making sure she was happy and secure. And do you remember what I said? You said you hoped I understood what security actually meant. My father winced. I implied that you weren't capable of providing for her properly. I essentially told you that love wasn't enough if you couldn't back it up financially. I felt my stomach clench. I'd never heard this conversation. It must have happened privately, before the engagement announcement. I was 29 years old and had just started my own company, Marcus said quietly. I understood why you'd be concerned. You were 29 years old and building something revolutionary, my father corrected. And I was too stubborn and narrow-minded to see it. The door opened again, and my mother appeared. She looked like she'd been crying, her carefully applied makeup smudged around her eyes. Francesca, my father said gently, but she walked past him directly to Marcus. I need to apologize, she said, her voice shaking. Not just for tonight, but for everything. For 3 years of treating you like you were beneath us. Marcus started to respond, but she continued. Margaret tried to tell me. She tried to explain that logistics technology was a growing field, that people in your industry were making enormous amounts of money, and I dismissed her because I'd already decided you were just some kind of computer repairman. Her voice cracked. On the last words, I convinced myself I was being kind, she continued. Protective. I thought I was helping you by not asking too many questions about your work, by not putting you in uncomfortable situations with our business conversations. Mrs. Castellano, Marcus began. No, let me say this. She looked directly at him, tears running down her cheeks. I didn't protect you. I insulted you. For 3 years, I insulted your intelligence, your ambition, your success. I treated you like a child who needed to be managed and protected from adult conversations. I watched this scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that my mother was finally seeing the truth, but sadness that it had taken such a dramatic revelation to get there. I gave you a Computers for Dummies book for Christmas. Vincent's voice came from behind us. He'd appeared in the doorway, looking as shaken as everyone else. I thought it was funny. I thought I was being, brotherly, teasing. You were, Marcus said simply. You all were treating me like family, just not the way I'd hoped. Vincent stepped fully onto the patio. How did you stand it? 3 years of us treating you like you were stupid? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Because I love your sister. And because I understood that changing your minds would require more than just telling you the truth. It would require showing you. You shouldn't have had to show us anything, I said, my voice fierce. You shouldn't have had to prove your worth to people who claimed to love me. Elena's right, my mother said quietly. We made you feel like you had to earn our respect instead of giving it to you, freely. The worst part, my father added, is that we convinced ourselves we were being reasonable, that we were just looking out for Elena's best interests. I looked around at my family, my father with his shoulders slumped in defeat, my mother with mascara streaking down her cheeks, my brother standing awkwardly in the doorway. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by their own recognition of what they'd done. So, what happens now? I asked. Marcus looked at each of them in turn. Now we decide if we want to start over, or if we want to keep pretending the last 3 years didn't happen. I want to start over, my mother said immediately. I want to know who you really are, not who I decided you were. We all do, my father added. If you'll let us. Marcus smiled for the first time since the revelation. I'd like that. But as we stood on that cold patio, surrounded by the wreckage of 3 years of assumptions and condescension, I realized that starting over wouldn't be as simple as they thought, because some damage once done changes the shape of everything that comes after. The week following Thanksgiving felt like living in a strange alternate universe where my family had been replaced by pod people who suddenly cared deeply about logistics, technology, and supply chain optimization. My mother called 3 times in 2 days, each conversation a painful attempt to demonstrate her newfound interest in Marcus's work. She'd clearly been researching online, dropping terms like predictive analytics and operational efficiency into sentences with the awkward precision of someone reading from a script. I had no idea how complex supply chain management could be, she said during Tuesday's call. I was reading about how disruptions can cost companies millions of dollars. Marcus must be so proud of what he's accomplished. The past tense wasn't lost on me. Marcus must be proud, not we're proud of Marcus. Even in her attempts at redemption, she couldn't quite admit that she should have been proud all along. Vincent sent a LinkedIn connection request to Marcus, followed by a message that made me cringe. Hey man, would love to learn more about your company sometime. Always been interested in tech entrepreneurship. Marcus showed me the message with a mixture of amusement and resignation. He's been sitting across from me at family dinners for 3 years, Marcus said. He could have asked any time, but the most revealing responses came from the family members, who didn't reach out at all. Uncle Roberto, who had spent 3 years offering Marcus financial advice and suggesting more stable career paths, went completely silent. No congratulatory call, no awkward apology, nothing. When I asked my mother about it, she admitted that Roberto was processing the news. Processing turned out to be code for too embarrassed to face the man he'd been condescending to for years. Cousin Anthony was similarly absent. The young lawyer who had earnestly recommended that Marcus pursue paralegal work for better job security had apparently decided that radio silence was preferable to acknowledging his spectacular misjudgment. The most uncomfortable encounter came on Wednesday, when I ran into my sister Bianca at the grocery store. She was standing in the produce section, examining apples with unusual intensity, when she spotted me approaching. "Elena," she said with forced brightness, "how are you doing? How's Marcus?" "He's fine," I replied carefully. "How are you processing everything from Thursday?" Bianca's smile faltered slightly. "It's wonderful news, obviously. We're all so happy. For you both. Though I have to say, it would have been nice to know sooner." There it was. The subtle shift from apology to accusation. Somehow my family's 3 years of willful ignorance had become Marcus's fault for not correcting them forcefully enough. "Bianca," I said slowly, "Marcus tried to explain his work. To you. Multiple times. You told him it was nice that he had his hobbies and suggested he consider teaching computer skills to children." Her cheeks flushed pink. "I was trying to be supportive. You were being patronizing. There's a difference." She abandoned her apple examination and turned to face me fully. "Look, Elena, we all made mistakes, but you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. Your husband goes from being, well, struggling to being worth $50 million, and you never thought to mention it?" "He wasn't struggling," I said, my voice getting harder. "You just assumed he was because he didn't fit your narrow definition of success. He worked from home in sweatpants, Elena. He drove a 10-year-old car. He never talked about money or investments or business growth. What were we supposed to think?" I stared at my sister, realizing that even now, faced with undeniable evidence of her misjudgment, she was still trying to justify her assumptions. "You were supposed to ask questions," I said. "You were supposed to treat him like a person worth understanding instead of a charity case who needed your guidance." Bianca was quiet for a moment, her fingers nervously adjusting her designer handbag strap. "I still think it's unfair that you let us embarrass ourselves for 3 years." "Unfair?" The word came out sharper than I'd intended, causing a nearby shopper to glance our way. "What's unfair is that my husband documented every condescending comment, every backhanded suggestion, every time you excluded him from business conversations because you assumed he had nothing valuable to contribute." "He documented it?" Bianca's voice was barely a whisper. "Every email, every text, every family group chat where you discussed his supposed failures. Every time Mom strategically seated him away from serious conversations. Every gift of career, guidance books and job search advice." The color drained from Bianca's face. "We were trying to help." "You were trying to feel superior," I corrected. "And Marcus has 3 years of evidence proving it." I left her standing in the produce section and drove home feeling more exhausted than satisfied. This was the pattern emerging. Family members, either overcompensating with sudden interest in Marcus's work, or defensively reframing their behavior as well-intentioned mistakes. But the most significant change wasn't in how they treated Marcus. It was in how they treated me. Thursday evening, my mother called with an invitation that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. "Elena, darling, your father and I were wondering if you and Marcus would be interested in joining us at the Pemberton Club for dinner this Saturday. The Harringtons will be there. You remember David Harrington? He's the CEO of that pharmaceutical company. And we thought it might be nice for Marcus to meet some local business leaders." The Pemberton Club, the exclusive country club where my family had been members for 20 years, where business deals were discussed over expensive wine and political connections were cultivated over golf. Marcus had never been invited before because my parents had assumed he'd be out of his depth with successful professionals. Now suddenly, he was worthy of introduction to CEOs and business leaders. "That's interesting timing," I said carefully. "What changed?" There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean Marcus is the same person he was last week. The only thing that changed is your perception of his bank account." "Elena, that's not fair." We're trying to include him. You're trying to show him off, I corrected. There's a difference. But the most telling moment came Friday afternoon, when I received a group text from my family's main chat, the one that had excluded Marcus from Thanksgiving planning just weeks earlier. Francesca, so excited to celebrate Marcus's success. We should plan a family dinner to honor his achievement. Vincent, absolutely. Maybe somewhere special. I know a great place downtown. Bianca, we could invite some friends too. Everyone will want to meet him. I stared at these messages with growing anger. 3 years of exclusion had been replaced by aggressive inclusion, but it felt just as artificial and self-serving. I showed the texts to Marcus, who read them with that same patient expression I'd come to know so well. They want to celebrate you now, I said. They want to be associated with success, he corrected gently. It's not the same thing. That evening, as we sat in our living room, the same modest living room where Marcus had built a $50 million company while my family dismissed him as underemployed, I realized that their dramatic change in behavior was almost worse than their original condescension. At least before, their treatment had been consistent. Wrong-headed and insulting, but consistent. Now they were trying to rewrite history, to transform 3 years of systematic dismissal into loving support that had somehow been misunderstood. They want to pretend it never happened, I said to Marcus, as we watched the evening news. I know, he replied. The question is whether we're going to let them. I looked at my husband, the man my family had spent 3 years trying to fix, manage, and improve, and realized that the choice wasn't really theirs to make. They'd shown us exactly who they were when they thought Marcus had nothing to offer. Now they were showing us who they were when they wanted something from him. Both versions were equally revealing. The breaking point came 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. My parents had insisted on hosting a proper celebration of Marcus's success at Romano's, the same expensive restaurant where my father had once magnanimously picked up the check because he assumed Marcus couldn't afford it. The entire family would be there, plus several of my parents' business associates who were suddenly very interested in meeting the tech genius they'd been hearing about. I should have seen it coming. The guest list itself was a red flag. David Harrington from the pharmaceutical company, Senator Morrison's business partner, the CEO of Millbrook's largest construction firm. These weren't family friends celebrating a loved one's achievement. These were networking contacts my parents wanted to impress. Marcus and I arrived to find the private dining room buzzing with conversation. My family was already working the room, and I caught fragments of their conversations as we entered. Revolutionary technology that's changing how Fortune 500 companies operate, my mother was saying to a woman in an expensive suit. We always knew he was brilliant, of course. Elena has excellent judgment. My father was telling David Harrington. Vincent was holding court near the bar, explaining supply chain optimization to anyone who'd listen as if he'd invented the concept himself. The key is predictive analytics, he was saying with authority. Marcus saw the potential early on. Smart guy. Always knew he'd make it big. I felt my jaw clench. Always knew? Vincent had given Marcus a Computers for Dummies book 6 months ago. Elena. Marcus. My mother appeared with her hostess smile at maximum wattage. Come meet everyone. They're all so excited to finally meet you, Marcus. Finally meet me. As if I'd been hiding from them, rather than being systematically excluded from business conversations, for 3 years. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in revisionist history. My family had apparently completely rewritten the past, transforming themselves from condescending relatives into prescient supporters who had always recognized Marcus's potential. I remember telling Francesca years ago that Marcus reminded me of the young entrepreneurs I read about in Forbes. Uncle Roberto told a group that included 2 venture capitalists my father had somehow produced for the occasion. You could just see the ambition in his eyes. This was the same Uncle Roberto who had spent the previous month avoiding Marcus's calls after the Thanksgiving revelation. Bianca was even more creative with her historical revision. "I used to joke that Marcus was going to be the next tech billionaire," she told Senator Morrison's wife. Elena would laugh, but I was serious. You could tell he was working on something big. I wanted to pull out my phone and read her actual texts from the past 3 years, the ones where she'd expressed concern about my impractical marriage and suggested Marcus needed more realistic career goals. But it was Cousin Anthony who pushed me over the edge. He was explaining to the pharmaceutical CEO how he'd always encouraged Marcus to think big when I couldn't take it anymore. "Actually," I said, loud enough for the surrounding conversations to pause, "you told him he should consider paralegal work for better job security." Anthony's face went red. "Elena, I was just—" "You said tech was too unstable and that he should look into more traditional careers," I continued. "You specifically recommended that he get his paralegal certification because it would be more reliable than computer work." The group around us had gone quiet, sensing tension. David Harrington looked between Anthony and me with the uncomfortable expression of someone trapped in family drama. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," my mother started, but Marcus placed a gentle hand on my arm. "It's fine," he said quietly. "Elena, it's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. As the evening progressed, I watched my family perform their carefully choreographed show of having always believed in Marcus's potential. They introduced him to their business contacts as our brilliant son-in-law and shared fabricated anecdotes about recognizing his talent early on. The worst part wasn't their lies, it was how easily their audience accepted them. These successful professionals nodded along as my family took credit for supporting Marcus's journey, never questioning why they'd never mentioned this tech genius before his $50 million success made headlines. Around 9 p.m., I excused myself to use the restroom and found my mother touching up her lipstick in the mirror. "Wonderful evening, isn't it?" she said brightly. "Everyone's so impressed with Marcus. The Harringtons want to invite you both to their Christmas party." I stared at her reflection. "Mom, do you actually believe the story you're telling?" "What? Do you mean?" "The story where you always supported Marcus, where you recognized his potential from the beginning, where tonight is just a natural celebration of someone you've always championed." Her hand stilled on her lipstick. "Elena, I know. We made some mistakes." "Mistakes?" I turned to face her directly. "You spent 3 years treating my husband like a charity case. You offered to help him find a job doing tech support at an insurance agency. You seated him at the kids' table during business conversations because you assumed he had nothing valuable to contribute. We were trying to be inclusive. You were being condescending, and now you're lying about it." My mother's composed facade finally cracked. "What do you want me to do, Elena? Publicly admit that we misjudged him? Announce to everyone that we were wrong for 3 years? Would that make you happy? I want you to be honest. With them, with yourselves, with us." "We are being honest," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We're proud of Marcus. We always have been." "No, you haven't." I felt 3 years of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. "You've been embarrassed by him. You've made excuses for him. You've treated him like a disappointing relative you had to tolerate for my sake. And now that he's successful in a way you can finally understand, you want to pretend that never happened." My mother was quiet for a long moment, her reflection staring back at me from the restaurant's ornate mirror. "Maybe," she said finally, "we're trying to make it up to him. By taking credit for his success? By pretending you supported him when you actively undermined him? By using his achievement to impress your business contacts? We're trying to include him now. You're trying to use him now," I corrected. "There's a difference." I left her standing in the restroom and returned to the dining room, where the celebration continued. Marcus was patiently answering technical questions from the venture capitalists, while my father basked in reflected glory nearby. As I watched this performance, I realized that my family's behavior tonight was actually more insulting than their previous 3 years of condescension. At least their dismissal had been honest. This celebration was pure exploitation, an attempt to leverage Marcus's success for their own social and business advantage. When we finally left Romano's that night, Marcus was quiet during the drive home. As we pulled into our driveway, he turned to me with a tired smile. "So," he said, "how did you like the alternate universe where your family always believed in me?" "I hated it," I said immediately. "I actually think I prefer their honest dismissal to their dishonest celebration." Marcus nodded slowly. "At least we know where we stand now." "Do we?" "Your family has shown us exactly who they are twice now," he said. "Once when they thought I was worthless, and once when they realized I wasn't. Both times their treatment of me was about them, not me." I looked at our modest house, the place where Marcus had built something extraordinary while my family systematically diminished him. Tomorrow, I knew, there would be more calls from relatives wanting to be associated with his success. More invitations to events where they could show him off. More revisionist stories about their unwavering support. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I was completely clear about what needed to happen next. Some relationships, once broken, can't be fixed with apologies or celebrations. They can only be rebuilt from the ground up, with honesty and humility that my family had shown no interest in providing. The question was whether Marcus and I were willing to accept anything less. 6 months later, Marcus and I stood in the kitchen of our new home. A sprawling contemporary house in the hills overlooking the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that stretched for miles. It was the kind of house my family would understand, the kind of success they could point to and feel validated about. We'd bought it not because we needed the space or craved the status, but because we'd finally accepted that our old life, the modest apartment, the careful budgeting, the humble presentations of ourselves, had been partially performed for people who would never appreciate the substance beneath the surface. The housewarming party wasn't my idea. Marcus had suggested it one evening as we sat in our new living room, still surrounded by boxes we hadn't bothered to unpack. "I think we should invite everyone," he'd said quietly. "Your family, my colleagues, our real friends, everyone together." Why would we do that to ourselves? Because I want to see what happens when all the different versions of who we are exist in the same room. I understood what he meant. Over the past 6 months, we'd been living compartmentalized lives. There was the version of ourselves we presented to my family, successful but gracious, wealthy but unchanged. There was the version we showed to Marcus's business associates, confident, accomplished, worthy of respect. And there was the version we were with our real friends, the people who had known and valued us long before the acquisition. The guest list for the party told the story of our divided world. My family, of course, had RSVP'd immediately, probably already planning how to leverage their connection to our success. Marcus's former colleagues from Harrison Tech were coming, along with several venture capitalists and tech executives who had become part of our professional circle. But we'd also invited Sarah from Portland, who had driven down for the weekend. Tommy, my young cousin who had been genuinely interested in technology rather than just networking. And most importantly, Mrs. Chen from our old apartment building, who had always treated Marcus with kindness and respect when he was just the guy who fixed her computer problems for free. The contrast between these different groups would be interesting, but I suspected it would also be revealing. My family arrived first, of course. They'd coordinated their arrival time and probably their talking points. My mother swept through the front door in a designer dress I'd never seen before, her eyes immediately assessing the house's value and location. Elena, darling, this place is magnificent, she gushed, though her tone suggested she was somehow responsible for our good fortune. You must be so proud of what you've accomplished, what we'd accomplished. Even now, she couldn't quite give Marcus full credit. My father was more direct in his appreciation. He walked through the main floor with the practiced eye of someone who understood real estate values, nodding approvingly at the high-end finishes and premium location. Smart investment, he told Marcus, as if the house were primarily a financial decision rather than a home. This neighborhood's only going to appreciate. Vincent and Bianca arrived together, their spouses in tow, everyone dressed as if they were attending a business function rather than a casual housewarming. I watched them take in our new circumstances with a mixture of admiration and something that looked like relief, as if our visible success finally validated their association with us. The dynamic shifted when Marcus's professional contacts began arriving. These were people who had known him as a respected peer long before our family understood his worth. David Chen, the CTO at Harrison Tech, greeted Marcus with genuine warmth and professional respect. Jennifer Walsh, a venture capitalist who had tried to invest in Marcus's company before the acquisition, brought her business partner specifically to meet him. I watched my family recalibrate their behavior in real time. Suddenly, they weren't the successful relatives graciously including the newly wealthy Marcus in their social circle. They were the family members of someone these powerful professionals wanted to talk to. The most telling moment came when Mrs. Chen arrived, carrying a container of homemade cookies and wearing a simple floral dress that probably cost less than my mother's shoes. "Marcus," she said, her face lighting up with genuine affection. "Look at this beautiful house. But you know what I love most? You're still the same kind young man who helped me set up my new phone last month." My mother looked confused. "You still help with computer problems?" Mrs. Chen smiled. "Oh, yes. Marcus has been helping me with technology for years. When my grandson needed a new laptop for college, Marcus didn't just recommend one. He set it up entirely and taught me how to video call with him. Never asked for a penny." I saw my family exchange glances. This version of Marcus, successful enough to afford $1 million house but still taking time to help an elderly neighbor with her computer, didn't fit neatly into any of their categories. The evening's most illuminating conversation happened when David Harrington, the pharmaceutical CEO my parents had been so eager to impress at Romano's, approached Marcus in our kitchen. "I've been meaning to ask," Harrington said. "How long have you been developing this technology? It must have taken years to build something so sophisticated." "About 5 years total," Marcus replied. "The early development phase was the longest. A lot of late nights and weekend work." "That must have been stressful," Harrington continued, "especially with family pressure to pursue something more traditional." I held my breath, waiting for Marcus's response. "Actually," Marcus said calmly, "Elena's family was very concerned about my unconventional career path. They suggested I consider more stable options several times." Harrington looked genuinely puzzled. "Stable options? Logistics technology is one of the fastest growing sectors in business. Didn't they realize the potential?" "I don't think they understood what I was building," Marcus replied diplomatically. But my father, who had been eavesdropping nearby, couldn't resist inserting himself into the conversation. "Well, you know how it is with revolutionary technology," he said with false confidence. "Sometimes it takes time for the market to catch up to the vision." Harrington looked at him with polite confusion. "I'm sorry. What do you do in the industry?" "Oh, I'm not in tech," my father replied quickly. "Real estate. But I've always been interested in Marcus's work." The awkwardness of that moment, my father trying to claim expertise in a field he'd dismissed for years, crystallized everything that was wrong with my family's current approach. Later that evening, as the last guests were leaving, Sarah pulled me aside on the back patio. "Your family's really something," she said, though her tone suggested it wasn't entirely a compliment. What do you mean? I spent 20 minutes listening to your sister explain how she always knew Marcus was destined for greatness. Funny thing, though, I remember you calling me 3 years ago, crying because your family kept treating him like a failure. I sighed. They've rewritten history. In their version, they were always supportive. And you're okay with that? I looked through the windows at Marcus, who was helping Mrs. Chen gather her things. He caught my eye and smiled, the same warm, genuine smile that had made me fall in love with him years ago, back when my family thought he wasn't good enough for me. I'm okay with the truth, I said finally. Their version doesn't matter anymore. We said goodbye to the last guests. My mother lingered by the front door. Wonderful party, darling, she said. You should do this more often. It's so nice to see Marcus in his element with all those important people. He was always in his element, Mom, I replied quietly. You just couldn't see it. She looked at me for a long moment, something flickering in her expression that might have been understanding. But then she smiled her practiced hostess smile and kissed my cheek. Well, you certainly chose well, she said. We always knew you had good judgment. After everyone left, Marcus and I sat in our new living room, surrounded by wine glasses and the detritus of successful entertaining. The house felt enormous and quiet after the evening's conversations. So, Marcus said, how do you feel about tonight? I thought about the question carefully. I feel like we finally know who everyone really is. And I'm at peace with it. Marcus had been right to invite everyone together. The evening had been a perfect microcosm of our last 3 years. My family's performative support, his colleagues' genuine respect, and the few people who had valued us for who we were, rather than what we could offer them. We'd built something beautiful together, not just the company or the house or the bank account, but a life based on substance rather than appearance. My family could claim credit, rewrite history, or continue their networking attempts. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we'd learned to distinguish between people who loved us and people who loved what we could do for them, and we'd chosen to build our future around the former. The next morning, I woke up in our new bedroom and looked out at the view of the city spread below us. Somewhere down there was our old apartment, where Marcus had built his empire while my family planned interventions about his lack of ambition. The distance between who we'd been and who we'd become wasn't measured in dollars or square footage. It was measured in the hard-won knowledge that the only opinions that mattered were those of people who had bothered to see us clearly. And that, I realized, was worth more than any acquisition could ever be. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, in spring, almost a year after the housewarming party. I was sitting in our home office, the same room where Marcus had once built his revolutionary software while my family dismissed him as unemployed, when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Elena, darling, I hope you'll consider what I'm about to ask with an open heart. I read the subject line twice. A favor for the family. The message was longer than my mother's usual communications, carefully crafted in the diplomatic language she used when she wanted something significant. The essence was simple. My father's real estate company was struggling. Several major deals had fallen through, and they needed investors to stay afloat. Given Marcus's business acumen and our fortunate circumstances, perhaps we might consider a family investment of $2 million. It would be temporary, of course, the email continued, just until the market stabilizes. And naturally, we'd offer generous terms. This is family, after all. It would mean so much to know we can count on each other in difficult times. Stared at the screen, reading between the lines. After 3 years of treating Marcus like a charity case, my family now wanted him to become their charity provider. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Instead, I called Sarah. You're kidding, she said after I read her the email. After everything they put you through, they want you to bail them out? It gets better, I said. She, specifically, mentions Marcus's business acumen, the same business acumen she dismissed as computer hobbies for 3 years. What are you going to do? I knew what I was going to do. The question was whether Marcus would agree. That evening, I showed him the email while we prepared dinner together in our kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd received the Harrison tech acquisition call while my family planned career interventions for him. Marcus read it twice, his expression unreadable. Then he set down his phone and continued chopping vegetables for our salad. Well? I asked. Well, what? Aren't you going to say anything? Marcus smiled slightly. I'm waiting to hear what you think we should do. I'd been thinking about it all. I think we should have dinner with them. All of them? All of them. Here, let them ask in person. Marcus nodded slowly. You want to watch them squirm. I want to see if they've learned anything. The dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday. My entire family arrived promptly at 7, dressed in what I'd come to recognize as their asking for favors attire, expensive enough to suggest they weren't desperate, but not so flashy as to imply they didn't need help. We made it through cocktails and the main course with careful conversation about safe topics. My father praised the wine selection. My mother complimented our new dining room furniture. Vincent and Bianca discussed their children's school activities with the determined cheerfulness of people avoiding difficult subjects. It wasn't until dessert that my father finally addressed the elephant in the room. Marcus, he began, his voice taking on the serious tone he used for important business discussions. I'm sure Elena shared Francesca's email about our current situation. She did, Marcus replied calmly. I want you to know how difficult this is for me, my father continued. I've always prided myself on being self-sufficient, on not needing help from anyone. But sometimes circumstances beyond our control require us to rely on family. I watched this performance with fascination. My father was framing his request as a noble sacrifice, humbling himself to ask for help rather than simply trying to access Marcus's money. The real estate market has been unpredictable, Vincent added, stepping in to support his father. Several deals that seemed solid fell through at the last minute. It's not poor business judgment. It's just bad timing. Bad timing, Bianca echoed. But the market will recover. It always does. This would just be a bridge investment until things stabilize. I noticed how they were all speaking to Marcus now, with a respect and deference that had been completely absent 3 years earlier. They needed something from him, so suddenly his opinion mattered. $2 million, Marcus said quietly. That's a significant amount. It is, my mother agreed quickly, which is why we'd offer excellent terms. 8% annually, secured by the properties. It's actually a quite generous return for family. 8%. I wondered if my mother had any idea that Marcus's current investment portfolio was earning considerably more than that in lower-risk ventures. And of course, my father added, there would be other benefits. We could bring you in as a partner in some of our future developments, give you a chance to diversify your holdings. Chance to diversify. They were offering Marcus the opportunity to invest in their struggling business as if it were a favor to him. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, cutting his dessert into precise pieces while my family waited. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I have a question, he finally said. 3 years ago, when you thought I was unemployed, would you have asked me for this loan? The question hung in the air like a challenge. My family exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such directness. That's different, my mother said carefully. 3 years ago, you weren't in a position to help. But if I had been, Marcus pressed, if you'd known then what you know now about my financial situation, would you have treated me differently? Another uncomfortable silence. Marcus, my father said slowly, I think we've all acknowledged that we made mistakes in how we initially assessed your potential. That's not what I asked, Marcus replied calmly. I asked if you would have treated me differently if you'd known I was wealthy. Vincent cleared his throat. I think what we're trying to say is that we're family, regardless of financial circumstances. Are we? Marcus asked. Because for 3 years, I was treated like someone you tolerated for Elena's sake. Someone who needed your guidance and protection. From adult conversations. Someone whose work was so insignificant that you never bothered to understand it. The accusation sat on the table like spilled wine, staining everything around them. We were wrong, Bianca said quietly. We've admitted that. You've admitted you misjudged my earning potential, Marcus corrected. That's not the same thing as being wrong about how you treated me as a person. My mother's composed facade was beginning to crack. Marcus, we're trying to make amends. By asking for money, he interrupted gently. Your way of making amends is to ask me to solve your financial problems. We're asking family for help, my father said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. That's what families do. Marcus nodded slowly. You're right. That is what families do. They help each other. They support each other. They try to understand each other's dreams and challenges. He paused, looking around the table at each of them. So, let me ask you this. In the 3 years before you knew I was successful, how many times did you offer to help me? How many times did you ask if there was anything I needed? How many times did you express interest in supporting my goals? The silence that followed was deafening. I can answer that, Marcus continued. 0. You offered career advice I didn't ask for, suggested jobs I didn't want, and provided guidance I didn't need. But you never once asked if there was anything you could do to help me succeed on my own terms. My father's face was flushed. We were concerned about your stability. You were concerned about your daughter's future, Marcus corrected. And you decided I was a threat to it rather than a partner in building it. I watched my family absorb this truth, their faces reflecting various stages of discomfort and recognition. So, here's my answer to your request, Marcus said, his voice remaining calm throughout. I'll give you the same consideration you gave me for 3 years. I'll assess you based on my preconceived notions, dismiss your explanations, and offer advice you don't want about how you should run your lives differently. He paused to take a sip of wine. Or, he continued, we can acknowledge that real family relationships aren't conditional on wealth or status. They're built on respect, understanding, and genuine care for each other's well-being. What does that mean? My mother asked quietly. It means if you want to rebuild our relationship, we start over. No more revisionist history about how you always supported me. No more networking opportunities disguised as family dinners. No more treating my success as validation of your judgment. And the loan? My father asked. Marcus smiled. Ask me again in a year. After you've shown me you can value me as a person, not just as an ATM. My family left that evening with their request denied, but something more valuable offered. A chance for authentic relationships built on honesty rather than convenience. 6 months later, my mother called to tell me that my father's company had managed to recover without outside investment. They'd sold some properties, restructured their debt, and adjusted their business model. It was actually good for us, she admitted. Made us more careful, more strategic. Your father says it reminded him why he started the company in the first place. She paused before adding, Marcus was right, you know. We never asked what we could do to help him. We just assumed he needed fixing. He's a pretty smart guy, I said. Yes, my mother replied quietly. He is. And we should have seen that from the beginning. It wasn't a complete transformation. My family still struggled with their ingrained assumptions about success and worth. But it was a start. And sometimes, that's enough. The most important thing was that Marcus and I had learned to distinguish between people who loved us and people who needed us. And we'd built our life around the former, while setting clear boundaries with the latter. That, more than any acquisition or investment return, was the real measure of our success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your key screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.